It is my great, tremendous pleasure to introduce our presenter for tonight, Doug McWilliams. Doug and I have been friends and colleagues for many, many years. I'm going to read you his official bio, but I'm going to interrupt it now and then to sort of elucidate how we know each other. Doug McWilliams is a musician and activist, husband, father, and grandfather, excuse me, who has spent the middle third of his life as an environmental lawyer in private practice at the international law firm of Squire Patton Boggs. He was educated formally at Oberlin College and the UC Berkeley School of Law, and less formally by the diverse array of individuals engaged walking across the United States and walking through Russia to promote global nuclear disarmament. That is how we met. Doug and I met on the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament, before I was a teacher, before I was a scientist, before he was a lawyer. And then the following year, in 1987, we and 200 other Americans walked with 200 Soviets through Russia from what was then called Leningrad to Moscow, again for global nuclear disarmament. His legal career focuses on creative conflict resolution applied to environmental law and policy. And in recent years, Doug examines and defines international best practices for the legal protection of sensitive ecosystems around the world. So again, this ties in closely with recent IRAS webinars related to auctioning off drilling leases in the Congo, for example. As he enters the third of his life, Doug seeks to synthesize his varied experiences to further discussions on global environmental issues, especially developing policies to promote good behavior from individuals, companies, and from nation states. So again, it's my great pleasure, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Doug has to say this evening. Doug McWilliams. Doug, you can go ahead and turn your camera on and get started.
Yes, I wish I could. There we are.
You are. Oh, saw you for a second and then lost you. All right.
Thank you, JD. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be with you all today. It is interesting in preparing this to talk for something that may be of interest to people interested in religion in an age of science. I would like to share some thoughts today about the evolution of climate policies. From my perspective, as JD mentioned, having invested now 30 years in a career as an environmental lawyer, this is an interesting time in our cultural evolution regarding what it means to be good and to do good in the realm of climate action. I've been casting about for guideposts for a moral code that can guide choices in an age of climate risk. Today, I ask whether religion has something to say on this topic. After all, religions have been influencing moral codes for millennia, and some on a global scale across national and cultural boundaries that could be relevant to a global ethical dilemma, like climate change. Perhaps there's something to learn from how religion has helped develop and sustain ethical behavior. But before we delve into the topic at hand, I want to be transparent about the influences and biases that I bring to this discussion. First, I'm entering the third of what has been a blessed life, full of cycles of risk, opportunity, and growth. It was in the first third of my life where I was most engaged with religion as an institution that motivated service to others, as an institution that offered values clarification guideposts for me in my teenage years and beyond, and provided rituals of belonging, often with music that nurtured years of exploration. For me, religion motivated ethical behavior. It made me want to be good and to do good. That first third is also when I met J.D. Stillwater. As he mentioned in the introduction, we had both been attracted to join this great peace march for global nuclear disarmament. And we walked from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. together. Hundreds of people gathered, acting in response to an emerging collective despair about Cold War antics, such as mutually assured destruction and the economic and social cost of preparing for nuclear war. This too was a reaction to a global existential crisis where we were compelled to act one step at a time. JD and I played music together in a band dedicated to motivating citizen action through lyrics and through dance. We found ourselves in the midst of musical rituals that at their best, empowered as they entertained and rejuvenated. But as this rich and wonderful musical adventure started to fade with my 20s, I dusted off that Oberlin College degree in environmental studies, and I went to work for an air pollution control district in Ventura County, California. This proved to be an excellent laboratory for testing environmental policy ideas to address some of the worst air pollution in the country, but in a relatively small market. After a few years of that environmental policy indoctrination, I felt compelled to take another leap of faith. So I disrupted a rather comfortable life, uprooted my wife and kids, and went to law school. The University of California at Berkeley offered me a wonderful opportunity to study environmental policy with some amazing thought leaders for 3 years. I have now been in private practice for over 30 years in environmental law. I represent a variety of clients with a variety of interests across the globe. My job is to understand their goals, their motivations, and to develop and execute a strategy that meets their often evolving needs. And in this process, I've witnessed the evolution of environmental policies and how it has attempted to address the climate crisis. Some policies work in the sense that they accomplish the outcome desired by their drafters, some not so much. Most move the ball, but in ways that may not be entirely efficient or ways that may cause unforeseen problems. I've spent this second third of my life amassing knowledge and experience about these environmental policies. So here I am in this transition to my third of life. At 63, it seems time to reflect on what I've come to know and to engage with others in the collective pursuit of thought leadership on the important issues of our time. This is what I hope to start today with you. So I bring a personal religious experience, mostly from that first third of my life when religion provided me this motivation to be good and do good. I understand that religions have also been used to motivate highly unethical behavior, but I ask that we set that aside for today. Today, we're looking to cherry pick those practices that have had some success in helping us be the best versions of ourselves, and to see if religion can offer any lessons for the development of climate policy. I was raised in a Protestant church with broad ecumenical exposure to other Christian churches and some Jewish synagogues, but my exposure to other religions is anecdotal and academic. So I invite you to correct any generalizations I make or offer your more developed insights from your knowledge and experience. I also bring over 30 years of experience in environmental policy and our attempts to address one of our toughest challenges, climate mitigation. So this is tough, not just because the science suggests that we're facing an existential threat, but it's tough because it's a global issue. And the benefit of local sacrifice to do the right thing can be so easily undone by local excesses elsewhere in the world. It can be disheartening. Ultimately, successful climate policy requires systems that motivate ethical climate choices across national and cultural boundaries. This is why I think religion may have something to offer. I also bring a sense of optimism that has been cultivated by my privilege as a safe and comfortable white male. I do not feel compelled to apologize for this privilege. I just acknowledge that it informs my perspective, and as a result, this perspective is limited. So I will benefit greatly from leaving space for you and others to express your perspectives, even when they're radically different from my own. I just ask that we approach each other with respect for the unique perspective we have earned along our unique life journey. I would like to start by defining some terms for this discussion. What do I mean when I refer to climate policy? These are systems that encourage or motivate actions that personally or collectively reduce the human effect on climate change. Climate policy can be local, like the incentives at my office to encourage biking to work. It can be national, like fuel efficiency standards for automobiles, buses, and trucks, or international, like treaties that phase out pollutants or promote carbon trading. They can mandate actions or they can mandate goals. They can use incentives or they can use penalties. They can tax or they can fund innovation. Policy is a broad array of options. But the right policy choice is not necessarily static. It will change as we evolve in our thinking. And based on our ability to build consensus around what is right and what is ethical in this area of climate policy. It's in this area that I invite you to lean in and explore what religions have done successfully to motivate collective ethical choices, and how we can use those lessons to improve our own climate policy choices. Francisco Ayala, in his essay, The Difference of Being Human, concludes that our sense of morality has both biological and cultural roots. So humans have the biological makeup that forms the necessary conditions for ethical behavior. That is, one, the ability to anticipate the consequences of our actions. Two, the ability to make value judgments. And three, the ability to choose between alternative courses of action. So we're biologically wired for ethical choices. But how do we make them? We have the capacity, but what drives the change? And Ayala posits it's cultural, not biological. And I agree. Cultural moral codes evolve, sometimes quickly, like the cultural support for gay marriage over my lifetime, and sometimes slowly, like the cultural support for equal rights across race and gender. In the United States today, the moral culture on climate action is at best a work in progress. It has suffered from the push and pull of political opportunism. Thus, when we talk about climate policy, it's important that we don't just talk about government actions, because government is not necessarily the solution. It's important that we also talk about individual, community, and corporate actions that advance our global climate policy goals. As an optimist, I choose to see each obstacle as an opportunity. So when the federal government is less amenable to climate policies, we look to states as the laboratories of invention that they were intended to be. And we look to the power that individuals wield, both as purchasers in the economy and as investors in business, to support companies with innovative climate policies. See, climate policy presents a classic challenge. How do we motivate behavioral change for a common good? The tragedy of the commons predicts that common good suffers when the work of individuals yields mutual benefits, as we will often choose to rely on the hard work of someone else for the benefit that we enjoy. It is challenging to motivate sacrifice when the benefit is shared, even when the cost of inaction is this existential threat to humanity itself. So to overcome this, successful climate policy does not just rely on the mutual benefit that is the solving of climate change to motivate behavior. Climate policy must create systems that motivate action based on regulatory consequences or incentives or a community consensus that move the benefit from out there to right here. Science tells us that climate change is upon us. Climate policy must continue to evolve to meet the challenges presented. But building this moral consensus on ethical climate behavior, it will require sustained work. As Dr. King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Like religion, climate policy will benefit from the perspective that we're in this for the long haul. Now, one of the tools that religion has used to motivate ethical behavior that we may want to consider is the commandment, the absolute prohibition. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal. Now, we do not yet have a tablet of green commandments, although thou shalt not burn fossil fuels has a nice ring to it. But we do have a corollary in climate policy that we refer to as command and control policymaking. In the religions that I'm most familiar with, commandments rely on a universal or near universal consensus that the commanded behavior is the right thing to do. We can agree that the ethical choice is to not kill, to not lie. Climate policy, however, does not have the luxury of universal consensus, even on issues where scientific evidence is clear. There is a notable exception, though, that we should consider, where we had near universal consensus on a global air pollution problem. In 1987, science had revealed a hole in the ozone layer, protecting people from cancerous solar radiation. The Montreal Protocol Treaty, signed in 1987, is one of those rare treaties that achieved universal ratification from all the countries of the United Nations. The treaty set a clear command and control mandate that banned CFCs, these are chlorofluorocarbons, and would ultimately ban most HCFCs, the hydrochlorofluorocarbons, as better substitutes emerged. While we were not really focused on its climate impact at the time, the protocol banned compounds that also had extreme global warming potential, many times higher than CO2 or even methane. So I will claim the Montreal Protocol as an early example of successful command and control climate policy. So let's look at why it was successful. Well, like religious commandments, there was a near universal consensus that banning these compounds was the right thing to do. And part of the reason was this ethical imperative to close a hole in the ozone layer that threatened human health. But part of the reason was also the availability of substitutes, or the confidence in our ability to find substitutes before the ban was effective and imposed, so that the refrigeration systems that we had become so reliant on remained viable. In other words, lifestyle disruption was minimized, principally by allowing the time needed for change and by providing public funding to leverage resources for innovation in this space as we moved towards the commandment, thou shalt not emit CFCs. Can this guide our other work in other areas of climate policy? Well, perhaps we could consider a ban on fossil fuels for electricity generation. I mean, like the ozone layer, science points to an existential threat requiring significant collective action to reduce climate change. And like banning CFCs, there are substitutes available to mitigate lifestyle disruptions if we combine renewable energy with other baseload energies like nuclear and hydrogen. And like banning CFCs, we could make the ban on fossil fuels effective in a reasonable period of time with public funding to leverage resources for innovation. But unlike the Montreal Protocol, we do not have near universal consensus that banning fossil fuels for electricity generation is in fact the right thing to do. Unlike the Montreal Protocol, there are broad constituencies who currently perceive themselves as burdened and threatened by a ban on fossil fuels for electricity. Coal mining communities, oil and gas producing communities, and others have been mobilized to resist threats to fossil fuels, let alone an outright ban for electricity generation. These communities see a more immediate existential threat to their livelihood that takes precedence over the less imminent threat of climate change. The impacts and disruptions of climate change and the climate crisis may eventually move more people towards a near universal consensus around the need for climate action, and we may at that time revisit bold command and control bans on fossil fuels for electricity generation. Until then, climate policy must look to more incremental tools for climate action. But before we leave command and control policymaking, we should probably note that universal consensus is not always a prerequisite for commandments or command and control for religions. I mean, consider fundamentalist religious sects that mandate behaviors that leadership considers ethical, but without universal consensus. When successful, these mandates tend to be easily detectable, enforceable actions like what you wear or what you do or who you hang out with. Successful mandates tend to work best with strong assertive leadership in small controllable groups. And these mandates are often enforced by community policing of mores with community penalties for nonconformance like shame or fear. Is this something that climate policy can use? Well, certainly climate policy has its share of fundamentalists pushing for mandates absent universal consensus. Climate activists with strong assertive leadership have had some success pushing a mandate for divesting from fossil fuel development within small groups. Not surprisingly, this approach to climate action is most successful in small controllable groups such as college endowment investors or pension funds, certain institutional investors that are amenable to the call for ethical and sustainable investment decisions. This does not require universal agreement on an ethical investing code, precisely because the majority of the potential constituency is silent or unmotivated to resist. A vocal and active minority focused on a single issue, like divesting from fossil fuels, can be effective in using brand risk as a form of shame to effectively motivate divestment decisions. I think we have to acknowledge, however, that fundamentalist mandates, both in religion and climate, with shame-based enforcement, often have a difficult time recruiting new adherents. And they're vulnerable to backlash and crackdown cycles that make it difficult to sustain without some form of authoritarian control. Shareholder climate activism has been subject to such backlash and crackdown in recent years. Leadership incurring costs in pursuit of reasonable climate actions have been criticized and sometimes sued for shirking fiscal responsibility to maximize company value. Though fundamentalist religions can assert authoritarian control in some circumstances, I can't think of an historical example of authoritarian control being asserted for a global benefit, like climate mitigation. It doesn't mean that states with authoritarian control are unable to consider climate policy. We actually see climate policies coming out of state-controlled governments. It just means that the policy needs to be motivated by a perceived local or provincial benefit. In conclusion, command and control mandates with universal consensus are rare in the current fractured area of climate policy. Mandates without universal consensus can be opportunistically successful, but they're hard to sustain in climate policy. So let's look at the next category of policy-making tools, what I will call aspirational collective goal setting. This is a policy category that relies on establishing consensus around a goal without mandating how you get there. Like President Kennedy's goal to put a man on the moon, we may not even know how to get there when the vision is created. But if we buy in to the vision of the goal setter, this policy-making tool can effectively inspire innovation in a competitive surge toward the goal. Religions have something to offer here. At their core, they need to get their followers to buy into a collective aspirational set of goals and then to stay on that path. How do they do it? Well, some religions admittedly threaten eternal suffering for the heathens who stray from the path. And while we have plenty of data we can use to threaten suffering if we fail to meet climate goals, the suffering is a shared burden. Climate calamities do not differentiate between the good climate actors and the bad climate actors. Importantly, though, most religions do not use fear alone. There is a promise of heaven if we stay on the right path, a promise of life ever after with our lost loved ones if we act righteously. So where is our promise of heaven in the climate debate? I guess for me, heaven is the promise that my granddaughters will inherit the birds, the woods, the lakes, the wonder of a resilient and adaptable natural world. My connection to that positive vision of the future, for me, is more motivating than my connection to the apocalyptic vision that the world we are leaving my grandchildren will be uninhabitable. At minimum, I can hold and cherish heaven in my heart. and mind, far longer than I can hold onto the hell of an uninhabitable earth. And religion teaches us the importance of balancing the fear of the wrong path with the awe and wonder of the right path. Perhaps we need a bit of ritualistic euphoria every now and then to offset the fear of a looming existential crisis. This may be very helpful in getting buy-in for an aspirational collective climate goal. We've had moments in the evolution of climate policy where we had enough buy-in for governments to use aspirational goal setting in international treaties and rulemaking. So let's look at that. The Paris Climate Accord set aspirational CO2 equivalent reduction goals for each developed country signing the treaty. Unlike the command and control approach we talked about first, these goals did not mandate specific action. They mandated a goal and a process. A method was established for measuring and reporting CO2 emissions from utilities and major manufacturers. Each participating country then agreed to meet their designated goal by reducing emissions from a 1990 baseline. However, since this treaty was addressing a global problem, countries were allowed under certain protocols to sponsor projects that reduced CO2 emissions outside of their country boundaries. These projects would generate certified emission reduction credits that a country could use then to meet their designated goal. One of these protocols was called the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM. These projects could only occur in a developing country, one that did not have an emission reduction goal, and credits would only be granted if the reductions were additional, could be validated, and the project created some additional local benefit above and beyond the reduction of climate pollutants. I worked on a contract for a Canadian utility under the CDM system. The Canadian utility would pay for a methane digester on a Chilean hog farm halfway across the world. The manure waste from the farm drained by gravity into a pond. The pond was then covered so that the methane generated by the manure was digested, combusted to generate electricity that benefited the local farmer. It also significantly reduced odor in the local community, providing an additional local benefit. The capture and control of methane was quantified and generated certified CO2 credits that my contract then transferred to a Canadian utility and were ultimately used to demonstrate compliance with Canada's carbon reduction goals under the Paris Climate Accord. By paying for this project in Chile, the Canadian utility was able to achieve a cost-effective emission reduction and forego a portion of the emission reductions it would otherwise have been required to achieve. Now, some could see this as a neutral utilitarian bargain. Others see this as an ethical failure. I mean, why do we allow the Canadian utility to do something less than reduce its own emissions? I wonder where you come out. In my career, I've helped develop and implement legal systems that use the power of markets as an incentive for innovation and to drive efficient emission reductions. For discussion, imagine a system that's designed to reduce emissions efficiently. It starts with a baseline year, and every subsequent year we target a 10% reduction. The cost for every participant is an accurate and reliable system for measuring emissions. At the end of each year, if you achieved more than a 10% reduction, you have credits to sell. If you have less than a 10% reduction, you have to buy credits in that market. Basic supply and demand determine the credit price. The penalty for non-compliance is significant and far exceeds the cost of participation. I've represented companies who generate emission credits by innovating, and I've represented those who buy emission credits from others because it's less costly than reducing their own emissions. Both buyers and sellers are necessary for the market to find the most efficient way to reduce emissions. However, we may not see those as equivalent ethical choices. Is the buyer falling short of our ethical climate goal? Is it enough to trust that the system produces ethical behavior if the individual choice falls short? I think religion has something to say here too. See, many religions, certainly those I'm familiar with, tolerate sin. They tolerate falling short of ethical mandates. They promote forgiveness. Hate the sin, love the sinner. We've heard that, right? Because keeping the fallen engaged in the community promotes future ethical behavior towards the larger aspirational goal. Similarly, in climate policy, advocates perhaps could benefit from forgiving the buyer who did not reduce his emissions this year. This requires some trust that the ethical result will arise even when individuals are falling short. When it works properly, a carbon trading market will tell the buyer when it is most efficient for her to reduce emissions and become a seller. Until then, she is doing her part. One, by disclosing her failings, a kind of confessional. Paying a penance to the seller, a few Hail Marys. And to the seller who achieved the ethical behavior standard, even when she fell short. If you're inclined to consider the buyer of credits as in an inferior ethical position, as opposed to a mere player in a neutral utilitarian, consider the religious teachings on forgiveness and the practical benefits that it may yield, promoting longer-term engagement in a system that promotes ethical behavior. The Obama administration proposed a carbon trading program in the United States. It was his first term. It failed to gain political traction. It was criticized by some because it allowed companies to buy their way out of their ethical responsibility to reduce carbon emissions. As we've discussed, taking guidance from religion, engagement is perhaps as important than ethical purity when building a climate policy system. It was criticized by others as a huge transfer of wealth. You see, the Obama trading program would auction the carbon credits and collect the price of those credits to be used for unspecified government programs. By not specifying which programs or how they could offset the increasing cost of electricity caused by the program, opponents were able to characterize this trading program as a poorly concealed tax to fund a liberal government agenda, and it failed. Religion may offer some lessons here too. Tithing to your religious home is revered ethical behavior. Being generous to those in need is revered ethical behavior. However, no matter how beneficent one perceives the government to be, paying taxes is not revered as ethical behavior. Of course, governments use tax dollars for a variety of purposes, some of which may be contrary to our personal ethical code. Also, we can't really out taxes if we disagree with the government without risking jail time. There's also an increasing number of people in the US that just do not trust the government to act in their best interest. Religious tithing dollars are more focused on furthering a specific ethical religious purpose, which gets the presumption of being ethical even when it is just keeping the lights on. And outreach funds reinforce the ethical purpose of tithing as we see our dollars allocated to those in need. Religious membership is also voluntary for most, so I can choose to stop belonging and choose a different institution more aligned with my personal ethical code if I choose. So taking these lessons from religion, I would make some changes to the Obama carbon trading system. First, I would focus on the system on furthering one ethical purpose. That is, narrowly finding the most cost-effective way to ethically reduce carbon emissions for electricity regeneration. Limiting it to electricity generation and transmission, which is inherently local, helps because it does not face the challenges of leakage when climate policy is imposed in one country, but its manufacturers can go to another country to make the same product without the cost of climate action. So since auctioning carbon credits increases the cost of electricity and utility bills disproportionately burden the poor, use the auction proceeds to pay the increase for the poor. Carbon tithing to help those less fortunate is a better way to think about the value of the carbon credits being auctioned. Since carbon credits are designed to make fossil fuels marginally more expensive, use the auction proceeds as well to generate vouchers for community college, for retraining those displaced in communities that rely on fossil fuels. Again, carbon tithing to help those in need. And finally, do not collect more in auction fees than is necessary to further the narrow ethical purpose. This is not an opportunity to fund other government programs. The success of the program depends on it being disassociated with the government taxation system. In conclusion, this category of aspirational collective goal setting has practical benefit in that we are asked only to reach consensus on the goal and not the action to get there. When well-structured, these goal-centered systems can reward innovation and produce collective ethical behavior, engages even those not yet ready to commit to ethical climate actions to a system that rewards them when they are ready. A third and final tool that I'd like to talk about is what I'll call sermonizing. Effective messaging on ethical behavior coming from someone you trust and revere. Religion ritualizes this presentation of the sermon by a priest or cleric or other leader on a regular cadence. Climate policy has suffered because the bully pulpits that we usually use for such environmental policy has become so politicized that no US president or party politician can hope to be trusted or revered by a significant majority of Americans on this topic. So climate policy needs non-governmental spokespersons promoting ethical climate behavior. I recently came across this wonderful quote from a non-governmental spokesperson who said, quote, "There are no lasting changes without cultural changes, without a maturing of lifestyles and convictions within societies. And there are no cultural changes without personal changes. Efforts by households to reduce pollution and waste and to consume with prudence are creating a new culture. The mere fact that personal, family, and community habits are changing is helping to bring about large processes of transformation rising from deep within society." This is precisely the type of message you want from a non-governmental leader to inspire climate action from individuals and communities and companies. Does anyone want to guess who said this? It was Pope Francis. In these polarized political times, we must look to others for sermonizing to motivate ethical climate behavior. We see this happening in the statements of the leader of the Catholic Church and others. We also see teachings on creation spirituality that encourage us to see God in the wondrous systems of nature and to serve as stewards for God's creation. We see it in green chalice principles in our congregations, or when communities decide to use their collective buying power to support companies making ethical climate choices. These individual and local actions start as ripples, but can turn into waves. We see an increasing number of companies declaring sustainability as a corporate value and announcing specific climate goals. Some have incorporated their sustainability ethic into commercials and branding that serve to remind us, like little sermons, that sustainability and ethical climate action is a common aspirational value. The motivations to make such declarations are not government mandates. Companies promote sustainability because it's good for business, and it is only good for their brand because they see a preference among customers and shareholders to buy from or invest in a company perceived as ethical on climate policies. By publicizing progress on climate goals, these companies offer customers and investors the opportunity to make purchasing decisions using ethical climate behavior as a criterion. In order for this to work effectively, of course, the representations made by companies must be accurate. They must be verified. This is where government policy plays an important role. Recent SEC guidelines and California policies and laws are requiring that companies making claims about their climate goals and any progress toward those goals must be transparent with how they verify such progress. Companies that wish to continue to present their progress on their websites must have third-party systems to verify their claims. With this good and verifiable information, shareholders may make investment decisions and customers may make buying decisions with greater confidence that we are supporting companies with aligned positions on climate ethics. It is particularly important to exercise these non-governmental ways to reinforce ethical climate behavior when we face political forces expressing opposition to climate policies. This is an important time to use our consumer clout and our investing choices and our own sermons to advance ethical climate choices in our spheres of influence. Ultimately, the lessons that religion may be able to offer for climate policy may be most poignant in religion's compassion for humanity in crisis. Because climate science tells us that we're facing a period when large populations will be displaced by rising seas and severe weather and climate calamity. Religions have traditionally offered moral and material support for refugees fleeing such crises. Religion promotes compassion and service to those in need as a good ethical choice. But it's not unilaterally. Religions have used mission and compassion to recruit those displaced into their community of faith by focusing on the current need instead of past transgressions. The lesson from religion for climate policy advocates is to incorporate compassion and assistance for the displaced into our climate policy priorities, and to focus on addressing current needs without blame or judgment for past choices. Compassionate resettling policies for climate refugees could present opportunities to build a constituency of support for climate action. The best opportunity for success is to make choices that further consensus on climate policy as the right ethical choice. I believe that religion offers some guideposts in this journey, not the least of which is the benefit of ritual in building community. J.D. Stillwater and I have had some moments in our lives where we have provided the soundtrack to this kind of ritual, creating opportunities for a collective euphoria to rejuvenate activists seeking to solve global nuclear Armageddon. We can testify to its restorative and motivational qualities for promoting buy-in to an aspirational collective goal. And as we face another global challenge, the climate crisis, hey, JD, it may be time to get the band back together. Thank you. I appreciate your time and attention.
I'm still chuckling at that last comment. Yeah, that sounds good to me. But honestly, you have given us a lot to think about. That was well done from my perspective. We do have a few questions. This is not usual, but most of them are coming from anonymous attendees, and that's okay. First one I want to mention is the person says, economic privilege makes addressing climate change impotent, as conspicuous consumption and opulence still define cultural success. I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
That's very important. I think it both blinds us to certain things, but it also, in my mind, creates responsibility. Those of us that had the benefit of economic privilege carry a particular responsibility to do more. And one of the things that is currently on the table in Azerbaijan is, where they're meeting to discuss global climate priorities, is this aspect of responsibility from the developed nations. They're talking about trillions of dollars of assistance to developing countries and small island nations that will be necessary to help them mitigate climate consequences. Trillions of dollars today seems like a huge amount of money. But if you think about the trillions of dollars over the 50 years or 70 years of industrial revolution and the consequences of industrial development in the developed world, those are the sort of reparations we should be talking about when it comes to the economic privilege being responsible to solve the crisis for the developing nations that are bearing, in many cases, the brunt of the consequences.
Well said. Another anonymous attendee is asking if you have insights about this observation that some religions view heaven in the sky, and therefore don't seem to care much about this planet's health, while other religions view heaven and nature as one, as a kind of holistic system, wouldn't dream of trashing the planet. Do you have insights about that and how that plays into the lessons we might learn from religion generally?
I find personally motivation to consider the earth as a part of heaven because I see it through the eyes of my granddaughters, right? I see the next generation and the generations to come. This notion that heaven is something otherworldly doesn't solve my concern that my granddaughters should be able to listen to the birds. So for me, creation spirituality makes sense. It invests in the children. It invests in the future, the 7 generations from now that should be motivating our planning cycle and vision. I acknowledge that there are religions out there that believe the rapture is imminent and that what we do here on this planet is necessarily ephemeral and inconsequential when it comes to protecting the planet. I'm not sure that's something we can solve in the debate on climate policy. But I think what we can do is encourage people to find ritual ways to engage with nature, with kids, with grandkids in a way that perpetuates the ethical motivation to consider future generations.
Stillwater writes, she thanks you for a fascinating and well done presentation and asks, what are your thoughts regarding folks who are not religious and have no interest in lessons that might be learned from religion?
I think there's another chapter here, and that's, what can we learn from other systems that motivate ethical behavior? I wanted to start with religion in part because you invited me to engage with religion in the age of science. And
right.
Religion is something that, as I said, in the first third of my life was a particularly poignant way to motivate my ethical behavior. And so I was fascinated with the idea of how religion might create guideposts for climate policy. But it's just scratching the surface. I would encourage Stillwater and others to engage in the next round of discussion, which should be about what other ethical guideposts we can find.
Nice. Last question. Anonymous attendee says, don't you think those of us in higher income countries need to change the lifestyles that we have become accustomed to, which is what has contributed the most to the change in climate? How does lifestyle fit into policy? But that last sentence was my question.
Yeah, I know.
The question's about lifestyle. Don't we need to simplify at least a little bit?
Yes, unquestionably. And it's really the most important. It's the most important question. Climate policy, particularly in the current political climate, is not something that is going to be advanced by political actors at the federal level. There are some states that are going to help facilitate and advance. There are some countries that will do better than we will. But ultimately, what I think comes out of this exploration is that we have power as individuals. We have power to make ethical choices about what we consume, about how we influence our spheres of influence with regards to the importance of climate choices, so that every time we buy something, we have an opportunity to essentially pull a lever for those manufacturers that are making a product in a way that is climate sensitive. Or every time we go outside into our communities, we can encourage a collective decision for all of us to engage in similar investment practices or buying practices that, again, promote companies that are doing it the right way. So individually, we can both reduce consumption and also leverage consumption so that consumption can influence and support companies that are trying to do the right thing in developing climate sensitive products. I guess I've seen quite a few companies who have made significant leaps of faith to invest in a significant climate sensitive product or process, only to find that the people buying the product are not sensitive to the additional cost and the long-term investment that is necessary to meet these climate priorities. Our opportunity as individuals to promote, to encourage, is as important in our economic system as reducing our own consumption. So it's exactly the right question, and I plan to do more and to do better to reduce my my carbon footprint in the world. I am motivated to do so every time I spend time with my granddaughters.
And that, I guess, is another lesson that could be borrowed from the religions of the world, the thinking globally while acting locally, but also thinking more long-term, thinking intergenerationally, which I think many of the world's major religions have done, and it's how they became major religions.
Mhm.
So, well,
That's right.
thank you very much, Doug. This has been great.